Good morning or afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar describing a national roadmap for grid interactive efficient buildings, or GEBs, as you'll hear us use a lot today. I want to let you know first that this webinar is being recorded, and we'll post it for your future reference along with today's slide deck. I'm Andy Satchwell. I'm a research scientist at Berkeley Lab and one of the Geb roadmap co-authors. I have just a few housekeeping items to mention here at the beginning. First, all attendee audio and video are disabled, and we ask that you submit questions or comments via the Q&A box that's available at the bottom of your screen. We plan to have ample time for discussion and encourage you to submit via the Q&A box during the presentation, really at any time. Also, I wanted to let you know we're using closed captioning, and the text box on your screen can be repositioned if you have difficulty seeing parts of the presentation slides. Let's go to the next slide. So I'd like to welcome today's presenters. We're joined by Monica Newcomb, the Grid Interactive Efficient Buildings Technology Manager in the Department of Energy's Building Technologies Office. Also, Marianne Piet, Director of the Building Technology and Urban Systems Division at Berkeley Lab, and Ryan Leddick, Principal at the Brattle Group. I especially want to thank Monica and David Nemzo, the DOE Building Technologies Office Director, for their thought leadership in advancing efficient buildings as a grid resource to drive the clean energy economy. They really are responsible for the vision behind this Geb roadmap we'll be presenting today. I also want to acknowledge the important contributions of many co-authors that we had on the Geb roadmap, including Dan Delury, Kitty Wang, and Aditya Kandakar. So at this point, I'm going to hand the mic over to Monica for her welcome and opening remarks. Monica?
Thanks for that introduction, Andy, and happy to be here to provide some comments from the Department of Energy. First, before I get into anything, I'd really like to provide some thank yous. I'd like to thank LBNL and Brattle for all of your excellent and hard work over the last year to make this roadmap a reality. Both the analysis and the recommendations that feed into the strategy overall are just stellar, and we think that this work will really help advance GEBs overall. And as Andy mentioned, I'd also like to thank David Nemzo, the Building Technologies Director. I joined the Building Technologies Office about 3 years ago to support David with our grid interactive efficient buildings work. And I can say with 100% confidence that without David's leadership and vision, we would not be nearly as far as we are today with the GEB initiative at the Department of Energy. And then last, just want to thank all the key stakeholders who have really not only participated in the roadmap, as Andy mentioned, but over the last few years, DOE has had a number of calls, workshops. We put out a request for information, and just across the board, people have showed up enthusiastically, provided really thoughtful feedback that has helped shape really the research agenda for our GEB work at Department of Energy. So we thank you for that continued feedback as we move forward in this work. And I know Ryan and Andy are going to talk through sort of the what and the why of grid interactive efficient buildings and the roadmap recommendations. So I don't really want to spend time talking on that, but I did want to emphasize two key things. One is just how important this work is to BTO and the Department of Energy. As we are mapping out, national goals for a carbon-free economy and carbon-free, sort of transition to a carbon-free grid. It's just becoming very clear how important the timing and the amount of energy use from buildings really is as part of the solution to that, especially from a cost perspective. So this work has definitely been very important to the BTO over the past few years, and will only be increasing in importance as we move forward. And then second, I wanted just to emphasize that a lot of the work that we discussed in the roadmap is happening today. I've spent the last 2 weeks with national and day-long meetings with with reviewers from across the nation for our Connected Communities Funding Opportunity announcement. And for that opportunity announcement, we really were looking for proposals in different regions, looking at different technologies, that are looking to look at grid interactive efficient buildings and the integration of many DERs, and looking at different partnerships with utilities, local governments, nonprofits, and looking at new business models. And I'm really excited after reviewing all the proposals, what we saw. And, it's across the nation, we're seeing proposals and projects where people are ready to demonstrate this today and move to deployment. So just wanted to call that out and acknowledge it. And it's one of the reasons why, we're most, really excited about the goal that we put forward in the roadmap, a tripling of energy efficiency and demand flexibility by 2030. We really believe where we are today with the technology and with demonstrations that we can hit this goal as we continue to push hard on all fronts and work with stakeholders that have outlined in the roadmap that we can meet this goal. So we look forward to doing that with you. And with that, I'd like to move the discussion along and hop into the meat of things. So I'd like to turn it over to Marianne Piet to give us a few more remarks. Marianne?
Thanks so much, Monica. And I'm going to start also with thank you to Monica and to David Nemso for their leadership in helping to conceive and partner with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and Ryan at the Brattle Group. And thank Andy for putting this all together, as Monica said. We're really excited to be making this presentation today. And we are really at a time where when we think about the energy use in buildings, we're really changing how we think about where we've been, what we're doing today, and where we're going. So that concept of energy efficiency has been a core research and deployment opportunity in the United States for several decades. And as Monica said, as we think about using less carbon in our energy systems, it's not just about how much you use, but also when you use that electricity. Because when we have more renewables on the grid, we want to soak up that clean electricity and use less at times when the wind and the solar and other renewable systems are less available. So that's a really important time. And many of us have been working on demand response for several decades. And the concept of demand flexibility builds on the very idea that the electric loads in buildings are flexible. So we want to be able to understand how to improve the flexibility, automate it, enable it, integrate it. And we want to integrate the flexibility of the electric loads with other distributed energy resources. So we have a lot of acronyms for you: grid interactive efficient buildings, or GEBs, DERs, or distributed energy resources. So as we think about photovoltaics, electric vehicles, energy storage, whether it's electrochemical batteries or new thermal energy storage systems, there's a big challenge ahead of us to think about the retrofit agenda and new buildings, and how we think about all the different types of buildings that we need to think of: residential, multifamily, commercial, office, schools, hospitals. So it's a lot of work to do. And we really look forward to partnering with all of you listening today and seeing this video later to help think about how you can help move the building sector towards this goal of tripling the power reduction capabilities and the energy efficiency. So I'll stop right there and turn it back over to Ryan Ledick. And I look forward to the Q&A. And thanks again for everybody for helping put this on today.
Great, thank you very much, Marianne. And I think with those comments, we are actually now just going to jump straight into the roadmap, because what you just said perfectly set up our introduction to the report. And that introduction is focused on answering this question: why grid interactive efficient buildings? Why do we care about making buildings more efficient and building loads more flexible now? Well, the answer is because it turns out that grid interactive efficient buildings can do a lot of the things that the grid needs now. Marianne just mentioned the potential for Gebs to integrate variable renewable energy. That's one key benefit that we've started to look at through this research. Gebs can reduce the cost of the infrastructure that is needed to support the development of all of those renewable energy resources, as well as new loads associated with electrification. Gebs can also help really push things towards decarbonization goals in terms of those benefits, but also just in terms of reducing our dependence on fossil fuel generation through efficiency improvements. And then lastly, and I think this is a Geb benefit that often gets overlooked, GEBs can help to optimize energy use based on consumer preferences, and as a result of that, really improve the consumer experience. So this is of course very much about improving the way the power grid operates, decarbonizing it, making that happen cost effectively. But this is also very much about providing benefits to building owners and occupants. So what is a GEB? At least it sounds like we're all getting familiar with the acronym now, but the question is now more a definitional one of what do we mean when we say that? So there are really kind of 4 key characteristics of GEBs, as you'll see in the report. And DOE always likes to lead with efficiency. GEBs are certainly characterized as more efficient buildings that have reduced demands for overall energy needs. But it doesn't stop there. GEBs are also connected. And by connected, we mean GEBs are equipped with technologies that can speak to each other and also to the building and to the power grid. So this is very much about communication, interoperability, and integration. The technology is also smart. So that means that buildings will have advanced analytics that can support not just efficiency improvements, but also the type of flexibility that Marianne was just describing. And then lastly, along those lines, GEBs are flexible. So we are talking not just about reducing the overall use of energy in buildings, but shifting that load around and trying to align demand with the needs of the system and reducing demand, particularly during those times of day when costs are high or when other grid services are needed. So that's a GEB in a nutshell. I mean, I came into this project thinking GEBs are really what we're talking about is energy efficiency and demand response for residential and commercial buildings. And in a sense, that's true, but we are talking about a much more advanced form of energy efficiency and demand response as we're at least used to thinking about it today. So the roadmap has a few objectives. We will start, and you'll see this in just a moment, we will start by estimating the value of the untapped GEB opportunity to the power system. So all those benefits that we were just describing, what are those worth? Then I'll turn it over to Andy, who's going to lay out really a vision for the Geb Vision, and in particular, a vision for the technologies, and talk about features and integration considerations. And so once we have defined that opportunity and laid out the vision, then the next question is, well, what's keeping this from happening? What are the barriers that are preventing us from getting where we need to go? We'll talk about that. We'll prioritize those barriers and focus on the most important ones. And then we'll conclude the presentation really with the meat of the roadmap, which is a focus on how we're going to overcome those barriers and specific recommendations for industry stakeholders for addressing those barriers and achieving that opportunity. So a thing to note here, I think this was mentioned in some of the introductory comments. This roadmap is built on a lot of feedback from a lot of stakeholders. We talked to well over 100 practitioners, researchers, regulators, and other stakeholders as we developed this roadmap and got a lot of important feedback. So we are very thankful for everyone who has made contributions to this roadmap, and hopefully some of you are on the call today. So last slide here, just in terms of introduction, just want to spend 30 seconds on the scope and boundaries of the roadmap. As we've alluded to, the focus is on opportunities to reduce and manage load in residential and commercial buildings, specifically over the next 30 years. We wanted to make this tangible, and we wanted the recommendations that come out of the roadmap to be tangible and actionable. So rather than being, a vision for what we need to do in 2050, this is a vision for what needs to happen for over the next 10 years. And these are things that we can start on literally today. The scope of the roadmap includes all distributed energy resources, but with a particular focus on energy efficiency and the active management of building electricity consumption. And that's particularly when we get to the quantitative piece of this, that is a key focus, is looking at building load and how we reduce that and manage that more efficiently. The roadmap includes actions and recommendations for all industry stakeholders, but these aren't intended to be prescriptive. These are key recommendations that motivated parties can take on to push things forward in this area. So that's the scope. And now we're going to switch over to talking about the opportunity. And I guess this is a bit of a spoiler, but as you can see on this slide, through our work, we've estimated the total potential power system value of GEBs to be between $100 and $200 billion over the course of the next couple of decades. Before we get into those numbers in a little more detail, just want to take a minute to talk about the approach behind the numbers and the methodology that we use to come up with those estimates. I think the thing to point out here is we were able to use and leverage a lot of modeling that has been developed not only at Brattle, but also at LBNL and NREL and by DOE in order to do this work. So as you can kind of see, as we've laid it out on this slide, there are a lot of different models that have been invested in over the years that are behind these bottom-up estimates of GEB potential that we've quantified. So the process started with defining the GEB measures that were going to be included in the analysis. We focused on the best commercially available technologies for major building end uses. And I think ended up modeling over 40 different measures in the analysis. Then through work with NREL and LBNL, the impact of those measures, those technologies, was simulated for thousands of different building types on an 8760 hourly basis for a variety of different buildings and weather conditions across the United States. We then took those detailed building level simulations and made them consistent with the size and building mix and weather characteristics of 22 different regions across the US and scaled the results up at that regional level. So at this point in the analysis, what that essentially gave us was a very granular look at the technical potential for GEBs, assuming all buildings across the US had adopted these technologies. And that is certainly an aspiration, but it's not necessarily something that we're viewing as realistic over the course of the next decade. So the next step here was to take that potential, that technical potential, and adjust it to reflect realistic, achievable levels of adoption of these technologies based on work that Brattle had done to review regional and national EE and DR studies. So the point here is this study is really intended to reflect something that can be achieved. It's definitely aggressive, but it's achievable. It's not a technical potential study. Then we, using some NREL modeling, developed a long-term forecast of power system costs. And then lastly, evaluated all of these different GEB technologies at the regional level against those cost forecasts to determine how much of those power system costs that are forecasted could be reduced through deployment and adoption of GEB technologies. So that's the approach in a nutshell. And now we will get into the fun part, which is the results. So we ran several different, having this modeling framework set up in this way was nice because it allowed us to look at several different scenarios around adoption and how the grid might look in the future. So if you start on the chart on the left-hand side of this slide here, what you'll see is this is our estimate of the annual system value of GEBs in 2030. So the value of GEBs just in the year 2030 in terms of avoided system costs. We looked at different scenarios around adoption. We had a low, mid, and high technology adoption scenario. We also considered a couple of scenarios around renewable energy adoption on the power system, and then also ran a sensitivity around capacity value, the value of avoiding the need for new generation capacity, as that tended to be one very important driver of the analysis. So you can see, depending on what you assume about those different variables in the analysis, there's definitely a range of results ranging anywhere from 8 billion per year to 18 billion per year across the scenarios. But what that ultimately amounts to in terms of a present value of benefits over a 2-decade period is that $100 to $200 billion estimate that I described in terms of avoided power system costs. Moving over to impacts, peak demand savings in 2030 that could be achieved through these programs ranges anywhere from 42 to 116 gigawatts. And on the energy side, by 2030, our estimate is that energy reductions US-wide could range between 164 and about 400 terawatt hours per year of energy saved. And what I'll do on the next slide is give you a little more context for those numbers so that they're a little more relatable. So what we're showing on this slide is both the demand reduction capability in terms of dispatchable peak demand through demand flexibility, and also the annual energy savings that could be achieved by Gebs. So if you start on the left chart with the first bar, the green bar, that is the 10.2 gigawatts that you're seeing on that bar is the amount of automated demand response capability that we have in residential and commercial buildings today. That's not bad. 10 gigawatts is a lot of capacity that we have on the demand side. But through our analysis, what we're seeing is in our mid-adoption scenario by 2030, we could more than double that and get to about 26 gigawatts of demand flexibility capability. And if we can push things toward the higher end of the plausible adoption range that we modeled, we can basically quadruple that existing residential and commercial DR capability. Moving over to energy savings, what we're showing in that first bar, again, is existing capability. And we've defined that as the annual energy savings that have been achieved in 2019, looking at the energy efficiency measures that have been deployed by utilities over a 10-year period leading up to 2019. So we're at annual savings over that 10-year period of about 221 terawatt hours today. Looking at Geb potential, the energy savings potential could more than double under mid-adoption and roughly triple under the high adoption scenario. So you might recall in Monica's comment, she mentioned DOE's goal of tripling energy efficiency and demand response capability in buildings relative to where we are today. And you now have some context for where that goal is coming from. So we've talked about the value, we've talked about the impacts in terms of demand and energy. There's one other really important thing to note here, which is, what does this mean in terms of carbon emissions and our ability to reduce carbon emissions? Falling out of this analysis, we have that estimate. Gebs could save, under that mid-adoption base case, could save 80 million tons of carbon, CO2 annually by 2030. That's about 6% of all power sector CO2 emissions. That's the equivalent of more than 50 medium-sized coal plants, or about 17 million cars being taken off the road. So this is a pretty significant opportunity from an environmental standpoint. And then the thing to note here, and as we're illustrating on this chart, is this opportunity varies significantly by region. So what we're showing in this chart is for each of the aggregated regions that we modeled, the kilograms of CO2 that would be reduced per megawatt hour of energy saved. So in other words, this is kind of the levelized emissions reduction opportunity per megawatt hour of energy savings in each of these regions. And what you can see is this does vary significantly by region. If you're looking at some of the regions that are still relatively dependent on fossil fuels, including coal, Midwestern regions in particular, you can see that marginal emissions benefit is significantly higher than in regions that are already further along down the decarbonization pathway, such as in the Northwest and California and parts of the Northeast. So this just sort of illustrates that there's really some regionality that needs to be considered when we think about how to move forward with Gebs and how to think about their value as well. So these are pretty significant benefits, but at the same time, I think in a lot of ways, our view is that our analysis is pretty conservative, and that's because there are a number of additional benefits that haven't been captured in our value estimate. So, for example, we looked at the avoided need for new generation capacity, reduced energy costs, ancillary services costs, and transmission costs, but our analysis doesn't include the potential to geographically deploy Gebs in a way that potentially could provide local reductions in distribution system capacity costs as well. We also haven't fully captured the potential for energy efficiency to contribute to reducing renewable energy, renewable portfolio standards requirements. It's also worth noting that there is option value associated with these resources. Our modeling assumes normal weather and load conditions looking out over that 10-year forecast. But as we've seen, particularly with recent experience in Texas and California, weather isn't always normal. And extreme conditions can really highlight the potential value that a resource like demand flexibility or energy efficiency could have when things get extreme. And so we haven't captured some of that additional option value associated with these resources in this analysis. There are also other consumer benefits potentially associated with improved satisfaction, choice, or even potentially comfort for the occupants that would be worth noting. And then lastly, and this is a really important piece, our analysis is, as we had said in that scoping slide, our analysis is focused on how to manage building load. But there's a lot of other stuff happening as well. Rooftop solar PV is being deployed. Behind the meter batteries are starting to be adopted by customers. Transportation electrification is taking off with adoption of electric vehicles. Heating electrification, there's a big policy push around that right now, obviously. So pulling in some of these other things that are happening kind of around the building and are starting to be added to the building, accounting for that, I think just easily could double the benefits that we're talking about here. But there is a lot that needs to happen if those technologies are going to all be integrated into buildings in a seamless way that can provide those enhanced flexibility and efficiency benefits. So on that note, what I am going to do now is pass things back over to Andy, who can talk a bit more about that Geb Vision and some of those integration issues.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so I'll now describe the Geb Vision that's laid out in the roadmap, including the key technologies that are needed and how they could be integrated to realize the economic and emissions opportunities that Ryan just presented. So let's go to the next slide. The Geb Vision is reflected in the simultaneous use of load flexibility and energy efficiency. Today, many current advances in smart energy management may drive significant energy savings, but they may also have minimal impact on demand flexibility. And similarly, although things like automated demand response programs promote demand flexibility, they may not necessarily provide minimal improvements in energy efficiency. So there's this evolution in program design that's needed to support both energy efficiency and demand response goals. So a couple examples. So first, for example, a more efficient and grid interactive heat pump water heater demonstrates the capability of the end use load to be met with energy efficient technology that also provides grid services through its connection to the grid. Likewise, improving insulation, reducing infiltration, and retrofitting single paned windows with high performance double or triple glazed windows would reduce the size of the HVAC system that's needed for heating and cooling, and also reduce the building's peak demand. These improvements to tighten the building envelope that I just described would improve the use of the HVAC as a flexible load, because the thermal energy to heat and cool the building could be stored in the building mass. So these are good examples of combining both energy efficiency attributes with load flexibility attributes. Let's go to the next slide. The Geb Vision that we've articulated in the roadmap describes the features of a whole building integrated approach. And we use it in the roadmap to identify innovations that are needed to move beyond individual technologies. So the Geb Vision is that a Geb is capable of providing energy efficient building services and dynamic grid services through connected, smart control of multiple flexible building loads and DERs. So this includes attributes like two-way communication between technologies, the grid, and occupants for responding to grid needs. Also, the co-optimization of multiple end uses to meet multiple objectives. So for example, improving occupant comfort and minimizing overall energy use. And also providing services to support the electric grid. So in the report, one key to this Geb Vision is technology integration, and we identified two important types. So first is the integration between the layers that you see in the blue boxes there on the right in that figure. So this integration between the layers is important to maximize the performance of each end use and avoid conflicts between competing objectives. The second important source of integration is integration across multiple end uses at the supervisory control layer. That's that top blue box. This is to take advantage of synergies between end-use systems, including distributed energy resources, and achieve further optimization of the building's operations. And interoperability, which is the ability of devices or software systems to reliably exchange information, is necessary. It's necessary for enabling, think of plug-and-play operation of these GEB technologies and the flow of information across all of these layers that I just described. And I also want to note that cybersecurity is obviously also critical and should be implemented as part of GEBs. Let's go to the next slide. There are a number of commercially available GEB technologies with high demand flexibility potential. Those that are available today include smart thermostats, water heaters with smart connected controls, and automated window shading attachments. At the same time, there's several key GEB technologies with more limited availability or are being deployed in pilots or are under development. So we identified these key technologies that exist in this entire spectrum of development through literature review and also expert input. So working from the bottom to the top in this figure, we start at the physical layer at the bottom. Certain end-use equipment and envelope system technologies have high demand flexibility potential when they're paired with control technologies, as well as high efficiency improvement potential through electrification. So some examples here would be heat pumps or HVAC and hot water combination systems, heat pump water heaters as well. Thermal energy storage is its own category in this figure as a subset of physical systems because it has unique demand flexibility potential. Technologies at the local control layer, which are the next level up in this figure, are represented by specific physical systems with controls. So things like connected lighting or connected appliances, as well as control technologies that work with building systems to enable grid interactive behavior. So all of the local controls and supervisory control technologies at the top of this figure are labeled as DF enabled. This denotes the addition of demand flexibility capabilities to automatically respond to grid signals and provide grid services. And then the last layer in this figure to highlight and the technologies associated are at the supervisory control layer. So this would illustrate technologies that can coordinate grid responsive behavior across multiple end uses. So for example, a smart home energy management system or a building automation system. They could also illustrate technologies that could enable grid responsive behavior across multiple buildings or improve capabilities of existing supervisory control systems like predictive control. Let's go to the next slide. So the discussion so far has largely focused on opportunities for improving the efficiency and flexibility of building loads and building equipment. But as something Ryan alluded to earlier in the presentation is that emerging trends show that the integration of DERs with building loads will become a critical element of the Geb Vision. So the additional benefits of coordinated deployment of building integrated DERs would improve that Geb value proposition that Ryan talked about. It would go beyond that $200 billion number. So for example, new building loads like electric vehicle charging could become a significant source of demand and demand flexibility if they were coordinated with building loads. Energy storage systems as well provide a variety of valuable Geb use cases. So it include things like resilience, so as a form of on-site backup generation, or to firm up PV generation when they're paired as a hybrid resource. PV has also grown rapidly and is a means to reduce building demand and provide clean energy back to the grid. And building integrated PV could be coordinated to reduce thermal envelope and lighting loads. Here on this slide in these boxes, we identify some cross-cutting research ideas to explore greater integration of DERs with buildings. They include improved tools to quantify the opportunity and communicate that value to building owners, designers, construction firms, and customers, as well as additional data to support load forecasting and operations, and also, I think very importantly, workforce education and training. And these are some themes we'll return to in the recommendations here shortly. So with that, let me pass the mic back over to Ryan to talk about how we can realize the substantial opportunities and achieve the Geb Vision.
Great, thanks, Andy. And as you just said, so now we have the opportunity, we've covered the vision, and now the question is, how do we make all this happen? That's the hard part. So we will start with just one slide on the barriers. There are a lot of barriers that have been documented through various reports and academic papers on challenges with pushing forward on energy efficiency and demand response. We've summarized a lot of those in the roadmap. We uncovered a few new ones as well. What we've tried to do here and throughout the roadmap really is to focus specifically on what we determine to be those top key barriers that are preventing progress in this area. And to organize our summary of those barriers in a meaningful and actionable way, we've developed what we refer to as the Geb value chain and have identified barriers that exist at each point in the Geb value chain. So the Geb value chain starts with developing technology. And that is where, obviously software and hardware developers and also researchers play a key role in dealing with some of these barriers. So key barriers related to technology and technical challenges include, current lack of standardization and interoperability among technologies, insufficient algorithms for controlling flexible loads, and then, kind of playing back to this theme of thermal storage, a lack of thermal storage technology that provides deep levels of flexibility. So those are some of the technology related challenges that are preventing us from doing more of what we've identified in that $200 billion opportunity and doing that more efficiently. Once the technology is developed, then you need to have the infrastructure available to get that technology deployed to buildings. Here, installers, aggregators and ESCOs and utilities play a key role in terms of that deployment and integration function. So some of the barriers here really exist around rules or limitations on the ability for these entities to really go out and deploy these technologies. So for example, in wholesale markets, certain rules limit aggregator incentives or even the ability to participate and go out and deploy technologies. We've also seen energy efficiency and demand flexibility pretty consistently being underrepresented in a lot of utility planning processes that reduce some of the incentives for these parties to go out and deploy the technology. And then also just as a general matter, there tends to be a lack of awareness or training among installers around some of these more advanced technologies that have only started to come on the market recently. So those are all opportunities for improvement in terms of deploying the technology. Then even once the technology is in place, or once we have the ability to get that technology in place and deploy it, customers need to want to adopt it. And to me, this is maybe the most important point in the value chain to address, where consumers, building owners, and building managers are playing a key role. So here, really, the barriers, there are a lot, but they relate to the value proposition, both making sure that customers can fully monetize the value of Gebs, as well as just making them aware of that opportunity. And also addressing consumer concerns around technology being too complex or expensive, or as Andy had alluded to previously, also addressing concerns around both data privacy and cybersecurity, which certainly have emerged as important issues in making all of this happen. The last step after customers have adopted the technology then is for utilities and grid operators to actually utilize that technology to its full potential to provide benefits to the power system. So a big barrier here, really two, in my view, two big categories of barriers here. The first is around trusting demand side resources to perform in a way that is as dependable as supply side resources. And then the second is, a lot of utilities, investor-owned utilities in particular, don't have the full financial incentive to pursue demand side measures over traditional supply side investments. And those are big barriers that need to be addressed. Now, supporting all four of those steps in the value chain are state and federal policymakers, regulators, and researchers and advocacy groups that are involved basically at each step in that process. And where we've seen the most traction being made in this fifth and final category is when there is a champion within these organizations that has made it their mission to make progress on energy efficiency and demand flexibility. And when there's someone who's willing to overcome that status quo bias and really push things forward in a leadership capacity to make progress in these areas, that's where we see from a regulation and a policy making and an advocacy standpoint, there being activity that leads to progress across all parts of the value chain. So that's it for the barriers, and we'll spend the rest of the time, leaving a little time for Q&A, talking about the recommendations in the roadmap for overcoming those barriers. Now in the roadmap, we have, I think, 14 different recommendations, and they've been organized into 4 different pillars, which represent kind of common themes across the recommendations in that pillar. So pillar 1 is oriented around advancing Gebs through research and development. R&D is the key there. Pillar 2 is about enhancing the value of demand flexibility to consumers in particular, but also to utilities and grid operators. Pillar 3 is about empowering Geb users and operations. And then pillar 4 is about really things that can be done from a federal, state, and local policy level to enable Geb programs and initiatives. So Andy and I are just going to walk you through the highlights of the recommendations under each of these. We're going to tag team this a little bit. So for pillar 1, I'm going to kick things back to Andy.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, so starting here with pillar 1, as Ryan mentioned, this offers recommendations for research that's needed to improve technology interoperability and integration, along with specific hardware improvements. So there's 3 recommendations in pillar 1, each that have several key actions associated with them. For the sake of brevity today, we've captured only 1 key action for each recommendation, just as an example, but the complete list of key actions is in the roadmap. So the first recommendation here is research, development, and accelerated deployment of Geb technologies. So in order to increase the capability, ease of use, cost effectiveness of high impact technologies that can provide this demand flexibility, opportunity, and capability in buildings, we need to support the development and field testing of user-friendly, affordable, integrated whole building control and grid service delivery. This, for example, might require developing lower cost and more accurate sensing options and system-wide control algorithms, among other things. The second recommendation in this pillar is to accelerate technology interoperability to optimize the efficiency and demand flexibility performance. This ensures that end-use devices, as well as DERs, we talked about buildings integrated with DERs, and also across multiple buildings, that all these can interoperate and coordinate to provide the building and grid services. So one key action here might be to accelerate the adoption of existing open standards. Some of these existing open standards at the application layer would include BACnet or HTTP, OpenADR, and CTA 2045. And then the third recommendation in this pillar is to collect and provide data and develop methods to benchmark and evaluate demand flexibility, technology, and building performance. This would ensure that Geb technologies, building performance, and customer cost benefit data are easily accessible and would improve and standardize analytical methods. One key action that we've identified in the roadmap is to expand energy efficiency benchmarking data sets and tools, for example, Energy Star benchmarking or building performance database, to incorporate demand flexibility data as well. Ryan, I'll pass it over to you for the second pillar.
Great, and pillar 2 is probably my personal favorite. This is really all about creating the incentives for customers to adopt these technologies and for utilities and grid operators to want them to be deployed and to use them. So recommendation 1 is improving and expanding innovative customer demand flexibility program offerings. What do we mean by that? Really what we mean is innovation is needed in terms of the types of programs that are currently offered to customers that encourage them to install, adopt, and use demand flexibility technologies. So, the example action here, as we've described, is pretty broad: design and market demand flexibility programs with a focus on consumer preferences. And to me, I think, at least one of the really interesting opportunities there is, as demand flexibility is pitched as an opportunity to consumers, to make it part of a broader package of things that consumers actually want. So kind of the classic example of this is smart thermostats. Typically when customers are going out and buying a smart thermostat, typically their primary reason for doing that is not because they want to participate in a demand flexibility program. They're buying a smart thermostat because it looks good, they can control it from their phone, and things like that. And the fact that they can save some money by unlocking this one feature around demand flexibility and participating in a demand flexibility program is basically just one feature of this product that they bought for a variety of reasons. You know, another example in this area, kind of in terms of packaging, is this idea of subscription pricing and providing customers with an offer of a totally fixed and predictable bill in return for that customer agreeing to sign up for some type of, you know, energy efficiency or demand flexibility measures. So the theme here is really just looking for innovative new ways to make all of these opportunities appealing to customers. Recommendation 2 is around expanding consumer knowledge and consideration of price-based programs. Really what we mean there is, you know, giving customers better access to and awareness of time-varying retail rates or rate designs that directly provide that incentive to consume energy more efficiently. A lot of times what we see happening is utilities will pilot a very innovative and interesting rate design, get great results from the pilot, and then things stop there. And so one of the recommendations in the roadmap is anytime a utility or any entity is going into a pricing pilot, to go into that with a plan for full-scale deployment. In other words, assume the pilot will be successful and have a plan for rolling it out at scale once the pilot has been completed. The third recommendation is around introducing incentives for utilities to deploy demand flexibility resources. As I said earlier, utilities don't always have, or often don't have, the full incentive that makes pursuing demand side opportunities as financially attractive as pursuing investments in supply side resources. So initiatives that are currently ongoing around performance-based rate making or incentive mechanisms that can directly provide utilities with that financial incentive to innovate and pursue demand side opportunities is key here to making all of this happen. Fourth recommendation is around comprehensively incorporating demand flexibility into utility resource planning. This is actually an area that Andy and I have both been working on through other research. And here the idea is in resource planning, not only to make sure that a comprehensive list of demand side measures, including a lot of the new and innovative measures that we've identified in this roadmap, are being considered, but then also to make sure that the new value streams and sources of value that those measures provide are accounted for in the resource plan. And that involves thinking beyond just, you know, what are the benefits of clipping our peak, and thinking more comprehensively about, you know, can demand side resources also provide ancillary services benefits or daily load shifting benefits or other things that a utility system might need, particularly as we decarbonize and transition toward different supply side resources. So I'll stop there and send it back to you, Andy.
Great. So Pillar 3 focuses on facilitating GEB adoption and use by developing a deeper understanding of consumer motivations to invest in these technologies, developing tools that can co-optimize the many energy and non-energy and financial benefits of GEBs, and shifting workforce training to include smart technologies. So these building technologies can be installed, operated, and maintained for optimal performance. So the first recommendation is to understand how users interact with GEBs and the role of technology. I think maybe this one is inspired by something like, you know, what we see on Amazon Prime Day. You know, it's really about taking the user design centric processes and implementing them for things like GEBs and the associated technologies. If you think about the deep understanding of certain consumer goods that we have in the market, really trying to evaluate and understand those relationships for GEBs could really empower users and adopt the technologies. The second recommendation is to develop tools that support the decision-making on the design and operation of GEBs. So this is really intended for everybody in the value chain around that decision to adopt the technology and install it. So one key action we identified here is to enhance capabilities of existing building performance tools to include demand flexibility and GHG information. So for example, to assess the feasibility and potential benefits of adding demand flexibility strategies as part of the building commissioning process. And the third recommendation in this pillar is to leverage existing building related workforce programs to integrate advanced building technology and operations education and training. A skilled, experienced, and diverse workforce is necessary to support widespread GEB adoption. One key action that we identify in the roadmap for this particular recommendation is to establish building, training, and assessment centers that could partner with local colleges and universities to achieve a wider outreach. Ryan, I'll pass it back to you to bring it home.
All right, so last but not least is Pillar 4, which is dedicated to government, state, federal, or local efforts to develop programs and policies that can enable GEB deployment and adoption. So recommendation number 1 is to lead by example. Probably I think the prime example here is government buildings can participate in demand response, energy efficiency programs and markets. And doing that can not only demonstrate that the technologies work and help utilities and system operators and building owners and operators to develop confidence in GEB technologies, but this also can show that there's a viable business model around all this. And this is actually something that can help the bottom line in terms of reducing costs overall. So lead by example is one recommendation. We also have a recommendation around expanding funding and financing options for GEB technologies. And the theme here really is, there already are a lot of funding and financing options and mechanisms that have been established for energy efficiency traditionally. And really what we're talking about here is trying to find opportunities to piggyback off of that and, basically modify or expand those financing and funding mechanisms to think more broadly about demand flexibility and the types of sort of GEB services that we've been describing today. Recommendation 3 is in a similar vein, expanding codes and standards to incorporate demand flexibility. Again, this is an area where we've seen a lot of progress happening on the energy efficiency side. Codes and standards have played a huge role in pushing things forward in terms of energy efficiency. And so the thought here again is, can we find ways to combine, for example, grid interactive requirements and open standards for automated communication with those energy efficiency requirements and try and pull in some of these other types of services into those codes and standards that will open the doors to services beyond just traditional energy efficiency. And then lastly, and this is an area where I think some impact can happen in a really meaningful way. There's a recommendation around at least considering implementing demand flexibility in state targets or mandates. And we have seen some recent examples of this happening already. The two that come to mind for me are in Oregon and Minnesota, where state regulators have established targets for utilities, or in some cases requirements, to go out and pursue new demand flexibility resources. So to the extent that at the state level, policies or regulations can be established that sort of push things forward in terms of identifying those cost-effective opportunities and either building a target or a mandate around that, we've definitely seen that leading to some increase in uptake of these opportunities as well. So obviously there's a lot more detail in the roadmap. That's just the highlights. What we will conclude with is just a quick parting thought before we turn it over to a few minutes of Q&A. At the beginning, in the introductory comments, Monica mentioned DOE's goal of tripling energy efficiency and demand flexibility in residential and commercial buildings by 2030. It's a great goal. It's ambitious but achievable, but it's not going to happen on its own. And as we've said throughout this presentation, the recommendations in this roadmap are designed to take us there. That said, it's not easy. It's not something that DOE can do on its own. So we've really tried to emphasize that all stakeholders will play an important role in implementing these roadmap recommendations and moving things forward. Strong leadership is needed. We'll need people who are very focused on making this happen. And I think as a consultant working on these issues for a number of years, I'm very excited about the amount of enthusiasm and energy that I've seen at DOE behind these issues and how much focus there is at the federal level on making this happen. So it's very, very encouraging. Definitely hope that everyone gets a chance to at least skim the roadmap and pick up some of the additional detail that's there. But with that, Andy, I guess I'll conclude at least my part of the presentation and turn it back to you for Q&A.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Yeah, I think there's some great questions that have come in during the conversation. In fact, a lot of great ideas, certainly for us to chew on. I did have just a couple of questions maybe to cover here in the last 5 minutes, maybe some for Ryan as well as for Marianne. So Ryan, there was several questions and comments around electrification. And I'm sort of curious, from your perspective as somebody who's quantified power system benefits of energy efficiency, from the power system's perspective, why is energy efficiency still important in a future of greater end use and transportation electrification?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And my thinking on this admittedly has changed a bit. When I first kind of discovered, a few years ago, electrification as this great opportunity and this decarbonization pathway, my thought was, well, if we're decarbonizing power supply, so we have clean energy, and then we can just power everything from electricity to take advantage of that, then do we need energy efficiency anymore? I mean, what we're talking about now is increasing load, not decreasing it, right? But as we've dug into this through some research and work that we've been doing, I've actually concluded that energy efficiency is more important in that future pathway than it is today. And that's because, if electrification happens at large levels in a big way, and it's totally unmitigated, and we lose our focus on efficiency and load flexibility, it potentially could mean really significant costs in terms of all of the infrastructure that's going to be needed to support all of that load growth. But if we package energy efficiency and demand flexibility with those electrification initiatives, then what that means is we can allow that to happen in a much more cost-effective way and facilitate that transition toward a decarbonized economy. So I think energy efficiency, load flexibility will play a key role, both just in terms of the overall cost effectiveness of these efforts, but also even more practically in terms of utility efforts to get regulatory approval for making the investments in all of this infrastructure that's going to be needed in the future.
Great, thanks, Ryan. Marianne, there was a question that came in. I thought, given your decades of work on building controls and communications, I think this is a good one for you. Someone asked, how does the Department of Energy play a role in supporting interoperability?
Yeah, thanks. I'm gonna first make a quick comment on what Ryan just said, because it's such an important idea about electrification that you want to put in the insulation in the walls and put in the new windows before you put in that new heat pump in either a large building, a home, or a small office. And when you put that heat pump in, you really need to make it a grid interactive heat pump, because it will make the electric load shape of that building even more problematic for the grid if we don't make that a grid interactive heat pump. So these bundles of measures are super important. The question about controls and interoperability is the concept of lowering the cost to innovation. When we require open standards, we allow more of the industry to collaborate with a utility program. If a utility program says, I'm going to use CT8 2045 or OpenADR or BACnet, then all the different control companies that are potentially going to be competing for putting controls into a large building or a home will know that there's some interoperability requirements. And we don't get vendor lock-in, which allows the homeowner or the building owner to have a broader field to choose the technology from. And the government can help understand how to comply with interoperability test standards, and then look at the costs, both the physical systems, the hard costs and the soft costs. And soft costs on a lot of these technologies are really important. And the interoperability certification and testing will allow us to do more sophisticated things at a lower cost.
Great, thanks, Marianne. That was great. And as usual, there's always more questions than we have time for. We've reached the top of the hour here. I know we were also able to answer several of them live as well, and also I was able to type in some responses to folks who asked for clarifications. But I would say we're open to your questions and feedback. Encourage you to go to the gebroadmap.lbl.gov site to download the report. Ryan and my contact information is there. You can reach out to us. So with that, I want to thank Ryan and Marianne and Monica for being presenters today. I want to thank you all for attending and for your great questions. And we look forward to continuing to engage with you all on this topic for many years to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.